Ryan is a visiting fellow, faculty fellow at Colby College, which for those of you who are not from the area is like 5 hours north of here, close to the in Maine, close to the border with Canada. But he works on Mexico, Cuba, and the Southern Cone. So one of the things that I found really interesting and that you might not know about his work is that he's conducting ethnographic oral historical interviews with activists, historians, and lay people related to the LGBT rights movement in Mexico. And he has worked in Mexican archives for over 2 years, sifting through what I hear is 10,000 papers. So it's a huge amount of very meticulous, hard work. He has one article under submission that is called Pink Socialism, Revolutionary Queer Changes in Cuba's Relationships with Homosexuals, 1993 to 2006. And I'm going to read a couple of paper topics that he has given at various conferences. One of them, Creating the Mexican Afeminado, Exile, Homosexual Identity, and the Islas Marias Penal Colony, 1929 to 1940. Another one, Homosexual Narratives in the Long 1950s, the Mexican Case. Another one, Old Signs of Sodomy and New Criminological Approaches, Mexico, Queer Sexuality and Science, 1874-1950, and many, many more. He has also won numerous teaching awards and fellowships, so a great colleague in the beginning stages of his career. And I particularly find his work interesting because there's so very little written about Latin American sexology. I found out thanks to Ryan, and desperately searching for things, and I thought, so maybe at some point you could address why that is the case. I hear your format is he'll give 10 minutes, and then Chiara and Aimee will give some remarks. So I'll introduce them right before they speak. Unless you want to hear the introductions now.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and as always, thank you to Doug and Veronica for putting together this really interesting group of people to have all these conversations with this summer. I thought what I would do, instead of necessarily rehashing the paper so much, is that I would give you a nice little slideshow, because photography is something that's kind of running in the background of some of our discussions. Reiner inspired me to show all of my photos in this way. But I want to begin as well with a list. Essentially, I sat down last night and tried to put together a list of some of the key moments in thinking about sexology as it related to larger things that are happening in Mexico. And it might be a fruitful place to begin our discussion because I refer to some of these things. I'm not sure how I feel in terms of integrating it fully into the argument so far. But essentially what is happening, if we begin in the 1860s rather, Mexico had just been invaded by France. This is Maximilian coming into Mexico. This is the origin of the song La Cucaracha, for example, which described Maximilian. It's one way you could insult him in the streets, or at least that's one story for it. There is a restoration, though, after Maximilian and the French are thrown out at the end of the 1860s, in which liberals come back to power. And we're talking about Benito Juarez here, the first indigenous president of Mexico. And one of the things that happens is under his regime, as it was right before he dies, they put out a new penal code. And this new penal code is based off of ideas coming from France and Spain that are far more liberal in how they're treating sexuality. They're looking at sexuality as a private act unless it causes public scandal or involves violence. Right? So that's where you get this Nuevo Código Penal. The first article I have found that mentions homosexuality in any kind of medical sense is from 1874. There may be earlier ones because the magazine that it appears in, Gaceta Médica, is one of Mexico's oldest journals, and it is before then. It extends back even farther. And it corresponds with a shift in the Mexican government. There's a 30-some-year dictatorship that is ruled by Porfirio Diaz, and he is sometimes called the Grand Dandy, or the supreme leader in this way. He liked surrounding himself with very pretty young men who were tall and of European descent because he thought it was good to look good in front of everybody else. There's also a story about him being duped by a German attaché who was dressed in drag, who he thought was a woman, and so he kissed this person on, the hand, and anyway, caused a big scandal. But he rules for this particular period, which is stable. So Mexico, from independence, which is in 1824, until this moment was a relatively unstable nation. And you get 30-some years of progress and order that's directed from the top. It's very authoritarian in this way. And yet, it's also the moment in which science is being implemented within the society. It's when criminology and sexology are being deployed by the government as a way of organizing society. And during that period, the terms, the pre-colonial or the colonial and pre-independence term of sodomy, then the post-independence term of pederasty, and effeminado itself, which literally means an effeminate man, become synonymous. And that happens in the 1890s. And so there's this convergence of what these terms mean. At the same time, in 1900, they built the Panopticon Lakenberry prison. This shows the various different convictions of the Mexican criminological group. The irony of this is, as much of my files are actually housed in this place now because it's Mexico's National Archives. So I'm actually sitting in the cells that maybe these other people were. And in 1901, the supposed birth of homosexuality in Mexico occurs during the famous 41 scandal. I'm going to show you a slide of that in a moment. But essentially, it's 41 men, maybe 42, who were arrested, half of them in drag. And it really converges the moment in Mexican history between ideas of male effeminacy and homosexuality as being the same thing. It's a public scandal. It's reported on the press for weeks, and then it also becomes a touch point thereafter for years. There used to be a joke in Mexico about the 41 that lasted up until about the 1970s. They used to not have 41 as a number on things, so books, ledgers didn't have the number 41. You couldn't go to the 41st floor. It went from 40 to 42. Men didn't turn 41, they turned 40 plus 1 or 42 minus 1, because if you said you're 41, yes, you're queer, right? In 1904, Los Criminales in Mexico, which was the first major criminological study, came out. Sexuality was one of the big categories in it. In 1908, the Islas Marias Penal Colony opened. I have written about this. This is another article that's under submission. And what's interesting about this was another solution that Mexico came up with. If we cannot rehabilitate these people, then we're going to send them off into the Pacific away from everybody and keep them away from the cities where they might actually contaminate everybody else. Mexican Revolution happens in 1910 to 1920, and yet at the same time the YMCA thinks that's a wonderful moment as the bullets are flying around to teach everybody about sex ed. So they're getting all the young men to come into the YMCA in Mexico City. There are actually pictures of the YMCA being in the middle of firefights, the same week that they're having some of these sex ed talks. And as I just mentioned, this is also a period of intensification of homosexual exile to the Islas Marias. And that particularly takes off after the revolution when the state starts re-solidifying power. It's also the beginning of conjugal visits in the penitentiary, which is a very early example of this in at least global history. 2 years later, the Tribunal de Menores. This is another positivist idea of saying we should have special categories of crime and have special courts to deal with those categories of crime. That appears. And the sex ed debates explode into public in the same moment. This is the moment that a lot of Catholic mothers are running into the streets and burning things because they didn't want their kids learning about sex from the godless socialist Mexican government that is the post-revolutionary government. There's also a culture turn against homosexuals that is happening. So the rhetoric of the revolution, the masculinist idea of people like Diego Rivera or Jose Orozco or Siqueiros, they're all positing the male body as something that is very masculine and defined against this trope of a homosexual, effeminate other. In 1933, Gonzalez's El Problema Sexual en la Penitenciaria comes out, which is the first study of Lakenberry prison, the Panopticon prison. In the same year, Criminalia, which is the big journal on criminology that often publishes things on sexuality, is put out. And then there's Margarito's case, which formed the opening of my paper. Comes out in 1937 in Criminalia. And the last set of them it's important to remember that in the late 1930s and early 40s, there's a bunch of Spanish immigrants that arrived due to the Spanish Civil War. Many of them are doctors. The number of doctors in Mexico City doubles because of the arrival of the Spanish. So it's about 1,000 by that point. There were about 500 before, and now there's 1,000. Mexican socialism's experiment essentially ends in 1940, and afterwards there's a shift to the right, and this means for the next 20 years is this gradual increase of state surveillance and repression oriented against homosexuals, all the way, if you skip to the bottom, the high point is 1959, when they try to close all of the major gay bars, not only in Mexico City, but in the majority of urban centers, as part of a big raid against these particular places. And the other thing that I would point out on this particular list is the 1958-1959 publication, which I don't mention in the paper, is Sodoma Pide Fuero, which was this fantastic book that essentially argues that the United States is an immoral country because it has 20 million homosexuals. It is a response to the translation of Donald Webster Corey's Homosexual in America, which happened in 1952. The original book comes out in 1951. And it's a defense by a homosexual of homosexuals. And this being the high point of Mexican xenophobia and Mexican homophobia, the response is this pseudo-official text that comes out and draws on sexology. It essentially says that all homosexuals essentially eat excrement, for example, and that you can trace this particular pattern all the way back to Rome. And since Rome was a decadent empire that collapsed because of homosexuals, so will the United States, and Mexico will be the way forward. This is ultra-nationalist kind of thing. But I thought I'd show you a few images before we continue. This is an image that got published, a broadsheet from 1901 by Jose Guadalupe Posada, who was a very famous engraver in Mexico. There were songs written about the famous 41. How cute and flirtatious is what this says, muy chulos y coquetones, right? And you can see them dancing in this way. All of them, whether they're in dresses or not, in representations of them, they always have mustaches, so that you can always be sure that they're men. Right? Oops. This is the map of where some of the homosexual neighborhoods were in Mexico City that I've been able to identify in terms of geography, starting in 1900. The center of the city is where the yellow is, and there's a little green park in it that was one of the main cruising zones. The main area now is this dark pink area, which is aptly titled the Zona Rosa, the pink zone. It was named that before all the gays went there, but it's one of the nice historical ironies. These are some pictures of people that were arrested in an animated dance. We're surprised, these afeminados that you see here. This is La Maginita, who was apparently a fortune teller and also a matchmaker, so she served to bring people together that were queer in Mexico during the 1920s and 30s. These are some men that were exiled to the Islas Marias, again playing up the stereotype of homosexuals being effeminate. They were also playing in the band, that's why they have the guitar there. These are some from the 1940s that were arrested on a bar raid.
Why 25 cents?
Oh, this is a magazine cover,
Oh,
actually.
okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Done by an expose that appeared in Mexico in 1947, actually. These are some of the men that are in Lakenberry prison that are all nice and posing here. I love this guy on the right, whatever he's done with his bandana. It's pretty awesome. There's a diva in Lakenberry. 4 more of them. These men were actually interviewed. There's an expose one, a different one in the 1930s. They were interviewed about their experiences in the prison. A little bit later. And still later. These are really young ones. I'm actually surprised that these young men are in Lakenberry because they appear to me to be of the age that they should have been under the Tribunal de Menores as opposed to be in the prison, and so this points to the failures at times of the system to actually define who was and who was not a minor. This is an example of evidence showing that this person has been examined. This is Manuel Sanchez Ontiveros, who I mentioned in the paper, and if you see down here at the bottom, he says after being examined by the medical section, the result is that he has signs of passive pederasty. This was a very common thing that would appear in the larger text. This is part of his sociological exam that was going on. As I mentioned in the paper, there's also psychological, medical, educational, and so forth. And to compare, this is one that was done on an adult. Again, there's also the signs of pederasty that you can see up here. Signos de pederastia. This is from the 1930s. I love this one because they're all posing. Right? And just for comparison, here are two of the men that were actually arrested who are not fitting into the stereotype of being overly effeminate. Both of them are also mentioned in the paper, Leopoldo Torres and Luis Sanchez Aguilar, and they look like regular guys in this particular way. It's kind of surprising that the Mexican police found them, to be honest. And here's another example. This is El Rafles, who is dressed like a Mexican cowboy, as opposed to an effeminate person in the stereotype. This is Jorge, who is at the end of the paper after his transition. I love the picture on the left holding the statuette and the Virgin of Guadalupe above him. And as you can see, he changed his name to Marta. This is his sister next to him. And this is the last slide I wanted to show you because this picture has a story. This is the expose that one of them that I mentioned, 1930s. This picture is of Eva Beltri, was the name that this man went by. This image reappears in Mexican publications over and over and over again as the example par excellence of what a homosexual looks like. It appears in tabloids, it appears in mainstream press, it appears in all kinds of publications. And then there's this moment in the 1940s or so when suddenly that's a lesbian. Like the reference is detached from being an effeminate male and becomes a masculinized woman. And is used again in those publications to represent lesbianism. So I thought that was a particularly interesting image to show you in this way, and how what is going on in these official categories. This man was in the prison, he was interviewed by a police tabloid, which is what this is beside it, and these are all the photos and interviews and kind of armchair ethnography that is going on at the behest of the government. Had this group come in to publicize how they were being reformed, and then how it percolates into the larger society as both an image originally of homosexuality and then of lesbians in Mexico as itself. So, those are my little slides.
First of all, I would like to say that I really enjoyed this paper. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment on Ryan's paper. Ryan starts his paper by exploring individual experiences of homosexual men who were examined and persecuted by Mexican criminal anthropologists. And then Ryan progressively broadens the scope of his analysis by looking at the ways in which Mexican sexologists incorporated and revised the international trends. Ryan offers a very rich essay that I believe engages with a number of important points. First, Ryan usefully employs Fernando Urtez's concept of transculturation. Second, Ryan locates his material within a long trajectory. Indeed, Ryan links early 20th century sexology with the early modern period. By linking criminal anthropological thought to Zacchaeus' forensic medicine, he shows how an anatomical way of thinking about sexual perversions persisted well into the 20th century. And when I'm talking about an anatomical way of thinking about sexual perversions, I'm thinking about Arnold Davidson's work. And I think that Ryan is the first person in this institute to link his material to early modern period, and I found this very interesting, and I would like to talk a bit about this perhaps during the discussion. Third, Ryan offers an intellectual history that is attentive to the broader political and cultural context. Finally, this essay engages explicitly with other essays presented in this institute. For example, with Pablo's essay, with Angie's essay. It also engages explicitly with Doug's observation on the existence of a Latin circuit of sexological knowledge. As Ryan says in his introduction, this essay could result in two or three different articles. So I assume you will have to make a choice and narrow down the scope of your analysis. Now, in response to the issues that you have raised in your introduction attached to this paper, I would like to encourage you to develop some points that might push your analysis a bit further. And I'm going to offer you a couple of very general points and then 3 specific points on 3 specific issues that you raise. First, a general comment. As I mentioned earlier, you show how Mexican sexology continued to rely on anatomical explanations when approaching male homosexuality in the 20th century. You also show that Mexican sexologists were eclectic and employed a number of approaches. They employed a psychological approach to homosexuality, they also employed an endocrinological approach, and so on. Now, one of your starting points is Ivan Crozier's work on British urology and homosexuality. Urologists, like gynecologists, for example, had an anatomical approach to sexual perversions which competed, for example, with a psychiatric approach. And at the end of the 19th century, you had gynecologists who were openly competing with psychiatrists to monopolize the debate on homosexuality, at least in Britain. Now, one way to look at sexology, at least medical sexology, is to think of it as composed of competing medical sciences that put forward different views on the body, on the sexual instinct, and on homosexuality. Texts like Ellis's Sexual Inversion clearly had a political agenda, so authors like Ellis, Carpenter, and so on adopted any theory that could be useful for their purposes, for their political purposes. But most of the medical doctors were only interested, I'm still talking about the period between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But most of the medical doctors were only interested in understanding, treating, and in some cases persecuting homosexuality. And from the second half of the 19th century, with increasing professionalization of medicine, there were different disciplines like forensic medicine, psychiatry, gynecology, and so on, that had different views on homosexuality. Different medical branches had conflicting interest in monopolizing the debate on homosexuality. So one way to explain the eclecticism of Mexican sexology is by exploring the purpose behind the sources you're using, the authors, and their audience. For example, you start by looking at cases of homosexuals who ended up in courts. I think that it is important to think of courts as specific sites of sexological knowledge and practice. In courts, psychological explanations were not so powerful if you wanted to persecute a homosexual, hence the use of anatomical proofs. So, one possible way to look at Mexican sexology and to give sense to this eclecticism is to look at Mexican sexology as composed of different medical and human sciences. Second general comment. You cover a long period from 1874 to 1957. While you have contextualized your topic very well by considering legal, political, and cultural history, late 19th century sexology is somehow absent in this paper. Indeed, at the end of this paper, I wanted to know more about the main characteristics of late 19th century sexology in Mexico. Related to this, I would have also liked to know more, to know when the first clinical case of sexual inversion was introduced in Mexican medicine. European historians working on sexology and homosexuality in the late 19th century have shown how important the introduction of the psychiatric category of sexual inversion was. Perhaps you might be able to provide further insights to Mexican eclecticism by looking at how Mexican sexologists re-elaborated Carl Westphal's concept of sexual inversion. For example, in Italy, Italian sexology re-elaborated Westphal's article in a very peculiar way. Now I'm going to give you more specific points that you read. I'm commenting some pages. Now, one thing that strikes me in your account is the prominent role of criminal anthropology within Mexican culture. It seems to me that perhaps one of the factors that distinguished the Latin bloc of sexology from Northern European sexology is the prominence of criminal anthropology. Such prominence should not be taken for granted. In British sexology, for example, criminal anthropology was not prominent at all, and medical men were skeptical about its use. When Oscar Wilde was persecuted, criminal anthropology was not used at all. Another aspect that strikes me within Mexican sexology is that positivism lasted longer than in Europe, and I wonder why. For example, in Italy, positivism was dead by the 1920s. Historians have pointed out that around 1910, positivism lost its appeal within Italian culture and science. Italian fascism then did a lot to destroy positivism. You have also illustrated the kind of European sources that Mexican sexologists used, and you have shown how European ideas were adopted in Mexico and at the same time transformed. Therefore, you engage directly with the main topic of this institute, A Global History of Sexology. You show how ideas traveled across continents. And I really appreciated how you show how Mexican sexologists selectively used the European sources and sometimes twisted them. In a sense, you're showing us that when tracing the origin of certain ideas, sometimes it can be very dangerous to take sexologists' understanding of their sources at face value. And this is an important point. However, I'm not sure about one example that you provide in your discussion. At pages 31 and 32, you consider Gonzalez's use of Havelock Ellis. You acknowledge that Ellis offered a nuanced view of femininity in homosexual men. Yet you seem to stress that Ellis emphasized femininity in male sexual inverts. I'm not sure actually if I understood your point when you quote Ellis at page 32. And you seem to suggest that Ellis offered a nuanced view of sexual inverts, but nonetheless, according to Ellis, male sexual inverts were effeminate. Now, amongst the European historians, there's been an ongoing debate on Ellis's association of female homosexuality with femininity, and this debate started really in the 1980s with Jeffrey Weeks, and then feminists entered the debate, medical historians entered this debate. Now, recently, Ivan Crozier, who you're familiar with, has convincingly shown that in most of Ellis's case histories published in his Sexual Inversion, Ellis stressed that sexual inverts were masculine and normal individuals. Now, I think that some reference to European historiography in the field is necessary, but I don't know to what extent you want to enter in specific historiographical debates. A final point. Since the title is Homosexuality and Mexican Sexology, I wondered where female homosexuality fits in this account. You mention it only briefly at page 26. I imagine that as you have lots of material here in this essay, you will narrow down your title, probably your topic. So I don't know if you want to develop this part of your paper, but it would be interesting to spend a few lines on female homosexuality. I would be interested to learn more on female homosexuality in Mexico. Overall, this is a very rich paper that I believe fits very well with other papers of the institutes. I don't think that all my points need necessarily to be addressed in your essay. My comments are just an attempt to suggest some directions to further develop your essay and perhaps push your arguments and analysis a bit further.
Thank you.
leave it. Thank you, Sylvia. It is really wonderful to have you as a colleague. And I'm just going to jump in, and because I fear that I did not organize my comments well enough, and I have a lot to say, all of which, to build on Chiara's sort of concluding disclaimer, is not prescriptive in any sense, but just hoping to open up different possible avenues for you that you are free to, pick and choose through. So of course, given my disorganized comments, my first comment is about organization. I really appreciated the little historical overview that you provided along with the timeline in the quick 10 minutes of setting up your paper. Because it did a lot of work that I'm not sure is in your paper even. Specifically, I wanted more of just a quick narrative about the dates that you're choosing to demarcate as the period of your history. And it was really helpful to think about that. And I actually jotted down some more notes about how you might shift sections of your argument around to highlight that temporal frame. My big comment is just basically on page 20, what's the title of that section? It's From Sodomy to Moral Outrages. And that's really where I kind of wrote to myself in a side note, historical overview, or precursor, premise. And I can understand, I was trying to see your rationale for opening with the Margarito's anecdote and then closing with the Jorge one. And I kind of understood why you would bookend the historiography that way. I kind of offer to you an alternative option, which is to bring page 20 on to the beginning. And then do the same kind of bringing into conversation Margarito's story with Jorge's story after. So rather than what you call a progressively larger scale opening out onto the history of sexology in Mexican society, I think give us the overview and then offer us these two case studies on complementary ends of your time spectrum. Not really, but two interesting cases that would bring out one of the claims about social history that you're trying to make in the paper and bring that to the fore. So let me be a little clearer here. I think, I'm gonna go next. Here, okay. So, Margarito in 1936, Jorge in 1953. I think one of the things that I thought could come out a bit more in your argument was the social history component of your project. How science gets mobilized, or sexology more specifically, gets mobilized in different moments of liberalism, social reform, social control. And how that relationship between sexology and criminology, which seems to be your real focus, persists and changes according to what geopolitical frameworks it's engaging or existing within. Okay. So one of my very tentative history questions for you, given that it's not my own discipline, I wanted to hear a clearer definition of the degree of transfer between Europe and Mexico and sexology. To what extent was it a set of proximate texts sort of in circulation and you are speculating into those connections? And to what extent were there like direct references happening? I'm not saying that to sort of privilege direct references over sort of an environment of sexological knowledge. But I thought there was a switching of modes in your telling the story of when there seemed to be very clear mappings of sharing of sexological knowledge within Europe, or even, yes, but less clear connections between Europe and Mexico. So I think you use the word such and such European sexologist is echoed in Mexican psychology as a word, and I like that. I think that does a lot of work for you. For example, when you are talking about Susana Solano's argument that there existed a certain sexual pathological affinity between the insane, criminals, and homosexuals, obviously, like, she wasn't the only one, right, in that formulation. So why point to her in particular? Is it a Hispanophone thing? Who is Solano in conversation with? Sort of trying to follow through your footnotes, it seems like the transfer of medical ideas in that section was strong between Michel Coulerier and Matteo Orfila, but it's not as secure in other places. So there is a really clear link, however, on page 28 when you're talking about Spanish doctors cited by transnational Christian student and social hygiene groups in England, France, Argentina, and Uruguay. Although I'm curious whether Gonzalez ever cites Freud or Lombroso specifically. I thought that was an interesting moment of uneven evidence about, this is not a critique of you, but it might tell the history a little bit better. Uneven evidence of how European sexological knowledge and Mexican sexologists taking up of that knowledge, I thought it was clearest at this moment of social hygiene, right? And your discussion of the YMCA, I'm like, why is that? What was so strong about the transnational formulation of social hygiene projects that isn't necessarily so in the other moments that you're looking at? And that, again, like, might work to pull out the kind of social history that I'm trying to do. You know what? Let me back up for a second. Sometimes I think it's helpful for commenters to read back to you what they thought your thesis statement was or where your main argument was. So I'm just going to do that. And it's in the conclusion on page 35. You know, the second and third sentences in your conclusion. This is what I think your stated ambition for the project is. Far from adopting foreign sources wholesale, Mexicans dubbed ideas and methods from an eclectic array of sources. Mexican sexology should thus be seen as distinct from other sexologies produced in the Latin bloc, as Mexico clearly engaged more directly with Northern Europe and the US, even as it retained significant interactions with Italy, Spain, France, and other Latin American nations. I also sought to make the social historical links to sexology more plain. So I included the first sentence of the second paragraph of the conclusion because I wonder, first of all, I'm not entirely sure that this articulated project that you have here is what ends up happening in your article. And I wonder whether you could actually, instead of making this second move to social historical links to sexology additive in your argument, you can make that more formative. What are the connections between, how do you bring together the argument that Mexican sexology is, at its core, transnational, transculturated knowledge, and the links to social hygiene and the transnational projects of that together in much more constitutive ways, right? So that it's not separate pieces of your argument, but actually one and the same. What forms of knowledge translate in a much more legible way and citable way than others? Okay. I also wanted to just put some pressure on the work that transculturation is doing in your project. Sylvia, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the valence of the word transculturation for me does the work of bringing partial, selective knowledges, cultural knowledges together in a way that has an end goal, though. Not necessarily. I mean, I think that's the way it's been. Transculturation has been formulated specifically like in the late 80s, early 90s. But I think there might be something productive in and maybe that's how you want to use it, because I think it might be interesting to think about what were the purposes behind these selections. It's clear that your argument wants to go in the direction of, okay, Mexican sexologists are picking and choosing. To what end? Why? That needs to be clear.
And if I can
think
add to what
yeah.
Aimee is saying, I think there's a collapse between, or parallelism that you draw between eclecticism and transculturalism that needs to be unpacked. I think that,
Yeah,
because it isn't just picking and choosing, it's not just eclectic.
right. Yeah, and I think there's something important that needs to be reintroduced to the particular case of transculturation in terms of European sexology to Mexico, and that's the question of race. And I'm going to pick a very peculiar moment in your paper to get into this question. It was your invocation of the word amphigenic on page 3. So my first questions were, and it's in quotations, so you're pulling it from a source. Where does this word come from? Amphibian, and I got thinking, is it the language of animals? There's like such a history of racialization there, right? In calling humans animals, right? Or making that connection. And then I started thinking about the work that transculturation is doing for you. And the questions for me were about, okay, if I'm a Mexican sexologist in the late 19th century, early 20th century, how am I going to deal with this very racialized body of work when I understand my own relations to Europe in various configurations of nationalism, liberalism, indigeneity, et cetera, et cetera? You know, what are the politics? In other words, is there a certain displacement onto other deviant bodies that happens in that transculturation moment? From sort of a racialized discourse of sexualized bodies to a discourse of criminalized deviant homo, right? And if so, it's a little problematic, or at least worthy of critique, yeah? Hopefully. Okay, how am I doing on time? I think, okay, I'm good, that's great. So I have another little nugget that I can offer to you as someone who is very invested in linguistic production. The language that you're using in particularly between pages 13 to 15, I would love you to take a little more care distinguishing between your own language from that of the medical jurists and the sexological discourse more broadly. So there are a couple of moments where you invoke the word contraindications. To me, that reads so much within the biomedical discourse that you're trying to upset. There's a slipperiness in a sentence on page 12. I'm just bringing these examples to you so you know what I'm talking about. I'm quoting you, although they did not use the term hysteria, the implication seems clear, given that he was prone to fleeing from rooms crying while he was drunk. And it's this kind of moment of lightheartedness and humor in your words, but it actually does some damage, I think, in terms of, I think you're inheriting unwittingly discursive moves that are troublesome to your critique of how sexological discourse renders gay bodies deviant, because I feel like you're complicit there for a quick second, for the sake of humor, and let's get rid of that. Because I don't think that's you. Also, you know, that whole section about hysteria is very interesting to me. Why didn't they use the term hysteria? Obviously, there's no uterus there to be off kilter, right? But it seems like you're locating a moment of contradictory logics that's being smoothed over purposefully, and maybe you could do more to seize upon that moment of erasure, of smoothing over the contradiction, and sort of do the work of reading against the grain of the archive that I always find so sexy whenever historians do that. Reading against the grain of the archive came up somewhere else, and I need to find it. Okay, 1 last minute. Okay, so this is where I get to insert my particular interests in hemispheric maybe formations, specifically Asian migration to the Americas, etc. But I wonder how you position the work you're doing in relationship to feminist theory, transnational feminist theory, specific and comparative ethnic studies. That's a lot. You don't have to address those, but that's my curiosity. And the particular example that brought this out to me was that quick moment when you're reviewing La Japonesa, and there's like that moment where like in prison, there's the figure of La Japonesa, and what work is she doing there? The Oriental queer. And I specifically started thinking about a colleague's work, Chase Smith, who's a Mellon postdoc at UCLA, maybe you know him. Works on like Chinese migration across the Mexican border, the ways in which the US-Mexico borderlands are always already both about Mexico and Asian migration together, but particular case of Chinese migrants who are in drag, who attempt to cross the border and are then thrown in prison and the whole deal. And it's very similar photographic evidence, by the way. But the work that I want that to do is to, you're doing so much interesting pushing about the transnational circulation of texts and cultures. And if you mean to make the move to the transnational communication of social ordering and hygiene projects, it might be interesting to think about that US-Mexico border as a highly regulated space at this moment. Like 1924, I think, is when the first US Border Patrol happens, and it's developed because of there are too many Chinese crossing the border. Okay, I rest. Sorry.
You rest your case.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you.